22 men under one roof, and I was their target. My father's laughter echoed every time my brothers hurt me. "Keep going," he'd say, "teach her to be a real woman." That day I swore my revenge would be as silent as it was deadly. Good morning, my dear friends. What a blessing to be able to talk with you today. I'm Mildred Thompson, 76 years young, born in a small town in Georgia, but now living here in Asheville, North Carolina, a mountain town so beautiful it feels like a little piece of heaven. Have you come to see our flowers and enjoy our cool mountain air? It's such a comfort for an old woman like me. Every day I wake up early, even with these joints that don't obey like they used to. I love to watch the sunrise while I brew my coffee, the old-fashioned way my grandmother taught me. Life is made of these small pleasures, isn't it? After coffee, I go to my porch to tend to my orchids. I have more than 50 pots, each with a different story. People walking by always stop to admire them. "Miss Mildred, what's your secret?" they ask. And I answer that plants are like people. They need attention, affection, and patience to flourish. I started with orchids after my oldest son brought me one as a gift about 15 years ago. It was a yellow cattleya, so delicate that I thought it wouldn't last a week in my hands. But it bloomed, and with it, a new love was born in my heart. Each new flower that opens is like a little miracle happening here on my porch. It was my way of learning that, even after difficult times, beauty can emerge in the most unexpected places. From my rocking chair, I can see the entire town below. The lights that start coming on in the late afternoon, the movement of people returning home. This small apartment is my kingdom, you know. The walls are painted a light blue that reminds me of the sky when I was a little girl. In the living room, I have my family photographs, only the good memories, because the bad ones we keep only in our minds so as not to give them power. On Sundays, my grandchildren come to visit. I make a cornbread with anise that they love, an old recipe I've carried with me through life's many changes. Seeing these children growing up happy and strong, without fear, is the greatest wealth I could have. When I look at them, running and laughing here in this room, I think about how life comes full circle and how God is generous in allowing us to start over. And you, my dear friends watching me now, tell me in the comments, which little town are you watching from? And what time of day did you find this video? Early morning with coffee, after lunch, or already in the evening? I always read all the comments, and I'm so happy to know where you're from and when you take a moment out of your day to listen to this grandma's stories. Let me know, okay? Let's create a chain of affection. Today I want to share with you a story I've kept for a long time, like a wound that heals slowly. It's about how a house that should have been a home can become an arena of suffering, but also about how we can, even in the darkest moments, find a way out. Because, my dears, life has this beautiful quality. It always gives us a second chance when we have the courage to seek it. I wasn't always this peaceful lady you see today, with hands that only know how to care for flowers and caress grandchildren. There was a time when these same hands trembled with fear and anger. A time when the sound of male laughter gave me chills. A time when being the only girl among 21 brothers was like living in a daily battlefield where I always lost. But this story of how I survived and freed myself, I'll tell you from the very beginning, back when I was just a little girl in Georgia, thinking the whole world was that farm where I was born. I was born in 1949, on a large farm outside a small town in Georgia. My father, Augustus Thompson, was a man everyone respected, or rather, feared. Tall, with that always well-trimmed mustache and eyes that seemed to see every thought that passed through our heads. Mama, Eleanor, was a small woman, soft-spoken with always busy hands. She seemed like a shadow in the house, moving silently, trying not to draw attention. Our farm was known in the region for cotton production. We had many loaded fields that extended as far as the eye could see. The big house stood on top of a hill, painted white with blue windows. From a distance, it looked like a beautiful, welcoming place. But the thick walls held secrets that no one in town could imagine. I remember it like it was yesterday, We were 22 children in total, 21 boys and me, the youngest and only girl. My older brothers, Gerald and Albert, were already over 20 when I was born. The younger ones, like Theodore and Oliver, were closer to my age. Can you imagine what it's like to grow up with 21 brothers? A house full of deep voices, heavy footsteps, constant demands. Our routine began before sunrise. Mama was already up at 4 in the morning, lighting the wood stove, preparing strong black coffee and grits for the men's breakfast before they went to the fields. I woke up right after her, and, even as a small child, I was already helping to set the long table that occupied almost the entire dining room. The plates were blue enamel with white edges, worn from use, 23 plates, 23 mugs. The amount of food that came out of that kitchen every day could feed a small town. At 5 o'clock sharp, Daddy would sit at the head of the table. It was the signal for all the men to enter and take their places. Mama and I would remain standing, serving. We would only eat later, in the kitchen, the leftovers, if there were any. The noise at that table was frightening. Knives hitting plates, loud conversations about the harvest, crude jokes, and in the center of it all was him, my father, eating in silence, just observing with those eyes that never smiled. When I was 6, I started attending the rural school that was about 2 miles from the farm. I walked alone on a small red dirt road. That daily path was my only moment of peace, you know. I would leave home while it was still dark and return almost at the end of the afternoon. The teacher, Miss Helen, was the only adult who treated me with kindness. She noticed that I learned quickly and lent me books. Oh, those books! They were windows to a different world, where girls could dream and speak up. At home, I had a small corner in the attic, under a broken skylight. There I kept my treasures. A notebook where I wrote stories, some colorful ribbons I found on the ground in town on festival days, a cracked little mirror. When it rained, water would come in and wet everything, but I didn't care. It was the only space I could call my own. The games on the farm? They weren't like those of other children. My brothers didn't include me in their ball games or fishing in the creek that cut through our land. When I tried to approach, I would hear, "Go back to the kitchen. This isn't for women." What they called games with me was different. It was hiding my few belongings, pulling my hair until I cried, pushing me when they passed me in the narrow hallways of the house. "You're learning to be strong, Mildred," Jerome would say, one of my middle brothers, as he gave me a slap on the back of my neck that made me see stars. "A woman has to learn her place." And my father? He watched everything from his leather armchair in the living room. A worn armchair with the shape of his body marked on the seat. It was like a throne from which he governed that small kingdom of terror. When he saw my brothers mistreating me, he said nothing. He just laughed. A hoarse laugh that started low and grew, like distant thunder approaching. That laugh froze me inside, more than any slap or push. Mama tried to protect me, in her way. When the men weren't around, she taught me little survival tricks. "Stay invisible, my child," she whispered as she combed my hair for school. "Don't draw attention. When your father or your brothers enter a room, you leave. Don't look them in the eyes. Don't answer back, even when you're right." At night, when everyone was finally asleep, Mama would come to my mat in the corner of the kitchen. I didn't have a room, unlike my brothers. She would sit on the cold floor and softly sing lullabies from her land, from the mountains of Tennessee. They were stolen moments of tenderness, which I kept like someone keeps water in the desert. There was a special song about a little bird that flew far, so far that it found the sea. I would close my eyes and imagine myself as that bird, flying away from that farm, from those men, from that life. One day, I thought, one day I too will find the sea. A strange feeling grew in me. It wasn't just fear I knew well. It was something that burned in my chest, that made me clench my fists when no one was looking. When I was about 10, I discovered that this had a name: anger. A silent anger which I fed with each humiliation, each laugh from my father, each night my mother cried in hiding thinking I was asleep. And so was my childhood, my dears. A time of learning to make myself small, of swallowing words, of lowering my head. But also a time of keeping inside me that little ember of anger that years later would transform into a strength I didn't even know I had. Because you see, even the most hurt children can grow and transform into women who no longer accept being diminished. And that's what happened when I entered adolescence, on that same farm, still surrounded by those same men, but no longer the same frightened little girl. When I turned 13, everything began to change. My body was no longer a girl's. It was growing, gaining forms that didn't go unnoticed by the eyes of the men in that house. I remember the day of my birthday, in July of 1962. There was no party, of course. In our house, a woman's birthday wasn't celebrated, but Mama had saved an egg for weeks to secretly make me a little cake. We ate it in the pantry, hurriedly, as if we were committing a crime. It was on that day that I noticed something different in Gerald's gaze, my oldest brother. He was 34 at the time, already married and living in a smaller house at the back of the property. He passed me in the hallway, stopped, looked me up and down and said, "Look at that. Mildred is turning into a woman. She's going to be trouble, that one." The way he said it gave me a chill in my stomach. It wasn't the first time I had heard comments like this, but there was something new in that look, something that made me walk faster to the kitchen, where Mama was. The days went by, and that uncomfortable feeling only increased. Now it wasn't just Gerald, but also Albert, Jerome, and even the younger ones, like Theodore. When I entered a room where they were, the conversations would lower and their eyes would follow me. Sometimes I would hear snickers and comments in low voices. I began to change my paths through the house. I avoided the shed where they kept the tools, the barn, the back of the yard. Whenever I could, I stayed close to Mama or one of my older brother's wives. I started to wake up even earlier, before Mama, to bathe alone in the outside tub when everyone was still asleep. It was on a Sunday morning that the first serious incident happened. I was in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes. The house was quiet. The men had gone to town for the Sunday market, except for Daddy, who was on the porch smoking his pipe. Mama had gone to take food to a sick neighbor. I heard footsteps behind me, and before I could turn around, I felt large hands grabbing my waist forcefully. It was Oliver, one of my younger brothers, who was 19 at the time. "Mildred," he whispered in my ear, "you're becoming a pretty young lady, did you know that?" I smelled the strong scent of whiskey on his breath. I tried to break free, but he squeezed me harder, pressing his body against mine, trapping me against the sink. "Let me go, Oliver," I said, trying to keep my voice firm, but feeling the panic growing. "I'll call Daddy." He laughed, a low, harsh laugh. "Go ahead. You think he'll do what? He'll just laugh." At that moment, I heard my father's voice coming from the porch. "Oliver, come here." My brother let go of me quickly, ran his hand through his hair, and left the kitchen as if nothing had happened. I stood there, trembling, my hands still wet from the dishes I was washing, my heart beating so hard I thought I would faint. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would I tell? Mama? She would lower her head and say I should be more careful, avoid being alone. Daddy? He would probably give one of those horrible laughs. From that day on, the incidents began to multiply. A pinch here, an inappropriate touch there, increasingly vulgar comments. It wasn't just Oliver, but several of my brothers. It seemed like a game to them, to see how far they could go, to see how much I could take before crying. And Daddy observed everything from his armchair. Sometimes he pretended not to see. Other times he laughed, which encouraged my brothers to go further. "Let the girl learn how the world is," he would say to Mama when she tried to intervene timidly. School became my only refuge. I would wake up while it was still dark and walk those 2 miles with a will I never felt when it was time to return. There, Miss Helen noticed that something was wrong. "Mildred, you've been quieter lately," she would comment. "Is something happening at home?" But I denied it. What could I say? That my own brothers treated me as if I were an animal to be hunted? That my father found this amusing? That each day was torture, an exercise in trying to be invisible in a house where all eyes seemed fixed on me? It was at school that I met Dorothy, the pharmacist's daughter. She was the only girl in the class who talked to me. The others, daughters of wealthier farmers, thought I was strange, too wild, with my patched clothes and my frightened manner. Dorothy was different. She lent me books, shared her lunch with me, told me about life in town. One day, she invited me to go to her father's pharmacy after school. I had never entered there before. Daddy didn't spend money on medicines, said that herbs from the woods cured everything. The pharmacy was a fascinating place, full of colored glass bottles, strange smells, and a kind man who smiled when he spoke to me. "Your daughter is very intelligent, Mr. Williams," I said, feeling a shyness that wasn't common for me. "She helps me a lot with my lessons." The pharmacist smiled even wider. "Dorothy talks about you a lot, Mildred, says you have a great head for numbers." It was the first time that someone, besides Miss Helen, recognized that I could be more than just a girl to work in the kitchen and endure affronts. I felt something warm in my chest, a new pride. I returned home that day with my head full of ideas. What if I could be more? What if there was a path out of that farm, away from those men, from that life? It was a dangerous thought, like a little seed planted that was beginning to sprout. But reality was waiting for me at home. When I arrived, I found the kitchen in an uproar. Apparently, one of the calves had escaped and no one could find it. Daddy was furious, yelling at everyone. When he saw me, he turned his anger towards me. "Where were you? It's almost 6 p.m. "At school, Daddy," I answered, knowing it was useless to mention the visit to the pharmacy. School, school, school. What good is so much school for a woman? You should be here, helping your mother. I lowered my head and went straight to the kitchen. Mama was there, cutting vegetables for the soup, her eyes red from crying. When she saw me, she just made a gesture for me to pick up a knife and start helping. We worked in silence for a while until Mama whispered, "Your father broke the vase that was my mother's, that blue one that was in the living room." I felt a pang in my heart. It was the only object that Mama had brought from her family when she married. A delicate vase, hand-painted, that she always kept with fresh flowers, even in the driest seasons of the year. It was her small rebellion, her little piece of beauty in a house where beauty was not valued. "Why?" I asked, also whispering. "Because I tried to defend you, said you had the right to study." She paused, breathing deeply. He broke the vase in front of me and said that next time it would be my head. I looked at my mother, that woman who had once been beautiful, but who now seemed to have aged before her time. The gray hair, the knotted hands from so much work, the eyes that no longer had any sparkle. It was like looking at my own future if I continued there. "We need to get out of here, Mama," I said, the words coming out before I could contain them. She looked at me, frightened, putting a finger to her lips. "Shh, don't talk like that. Where would we go? How would we live?" It was a valid question. 2 women alone, without money, without protection, in a world that wasn't kind to helpless women. But the seed had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, lying on my mat in the kitchen, I made a silent vow. I would find a way out of there. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I wouldn't end up like my mother, a shadow of a person, living in fear, dying a little each day. The next day, I noticed something different. My brothers were agitated, talking about a visitor who would come to the farm, an important man from town, someone Daddy wanted to impress. Everyone was instructed to behave, the house was cleaned like never before, and Mama spent the day cooking special dishes. The visitor arrived late in the afternoon in a shiny car that raised dust on the dirt road. It was the county commissioner, a fat man in a tight suit and a gold watch that shined on his wrist. He had come to negotiate the purchase of part of our cotton production for export. I stayed in the kitchen, helping Mama serve the food while the men talked in the living room. The commissioner spoke loudly, laughed a lot, drank the wine that Daddy had kept for special occasions. Daddy was different, submissive, almost servile, agreeing with everything the visitor said. It was when I served the dessert that I heard something that changed everything. The commissioner was commenting on the difficulties of finding qualified labor for his cotton processing factory in town. "We need people who can read and do accounts," he was saying, as I placed the peach cobbler in front of him. "It's increasingly difficult to find." Without thinking, I said, "I can read and do accounts, sir. Miss Helen says I'm the best student in the school." A deadly silence fell over the room. Daddy looked at me as if I had committed the worst sin. A woman speaking without being asked, in front of an important visitor. I felt my blood freeze in my veins, waiting for the explosion. But, to my surprise, the commissioner smiled. "Is that so? An educated young lady? That's rare in these parts." At that moment, I saw something in my father's eyes that I had never seen before. It wasn't just anger, it was fear. Fear because for the first time, someone from outside that farm had seen me as a person, not just as a silent shadow. And that's when I realized his power over us came from isolation. As long as no one from the outside knew what happened within those walls, he could do whatever he wanted. That night marked the beginning of my true rebellion. Not an open rebellion, with screams and escapes. I still didn't have the strength or means for that. But a silent rebellion, fueled by that seed of hope that was now beginning to grow stronger within me. The months that followed the dinner with the commissioner were the most difficult of my life. Daddy was furious with me for having spoken without permission. When the visitor left, he called me to the tool shed. It was a dark place, full of shadows, the smell of rust and oil impregnated in the wooden walls. "Who do you think you are to speak in front of important men?" he shouted, pointing his finger at my face. "Do you want to embarrass me? Do you want people to think I can't control my own house?" I remained silent, looking at the ground, knowing that any response would only make the situation worse. "Starting tomorrow, you will no longer go to that school. You've already wasted too much time with these nonsense. A woman's place is in the kitchen, not with her head full of ideas." I felt as if I had been punched in the stomach. School was my only refuge, my only connection to a world different from that hell. It was the first time I confronted my father. "No, Daddy, I need to study, please." He was so surprised by my response that for a moment he just stared at me, speechless. Then, a frightening calm came over him. He smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So you've learned to talk back, huh? We'll see if that courage lasts." That night, he gathered all my brothers in the living room. Mama and I were serving coffee while he spoke. "It seems our Mildred is getting too bold. She thinks she can disrespect her father, speak when not called upon. You know what happens to a woman who doesn't know her place, don't you?" A heavy silence fell over the room. My brothers looked at each other, some looking uncomfortable, others with small smiles at the corners of their mouths. "Starting today, she's going to learn some lessons." "She wants so much to go to school? Then let's see if she learns. I don't want anyone making life easier for her. When she's ready to apologize and accept her place, then she can return to the normal routine." It was the beginning of what I called, in my thoughts, the months of purgatory. Every day, I would wake up before dawn to do all the tasks that were previously divided between me and Mama. Lighting the stove, preparing coffee, milking the cows, cleaning the rooms, washing clothes at the edge of the creek. I worked from sunrise to sunset under the watchful eyes of my brothers, who seemed to have received orders to keep me busy all the time. "Mildred, the chicken coop fence needs repair," Albert would say, right after I finished washing the lunch dishes. "Mildred, Daddy wants you to clean the barn today," Theodore would order when I returned, exhausted, from the chicken coop. My hands, which were only rough before, were now raw, with cuts and blisters that didn't have time to heal. My clothes hung on an increasingly thin body. With so much work, I barely had time to eat. Mama tried to help me in secret, but there was little she could do without attracting my father's wrath. Sometimes she would save a piece of bread or a boiled egg for me, hidden between the dish towels. Other times, she would take on some of my tasks when my father and my brothers were in the fields. "You need to apologize to your father," she would tell me, tears in her eyes. "Please, daughter, this is killing you." But I couldn't. Something inside me, that little ember of anger that was now a constant flame, wouldn't allow me to give him that satisfaction. I knew it wasn't just an apology he wanted. It was my complete submission, my giving up of any dream beyond that farm. Worse than the exhausting work were the looks and touches from my brothers. With the implicit permission from my father to teach me lessons, they felt entitled to treat me as they wished. The pinches became grabs, the rude words transformed into obscenities whispered when no one was around. Jerome was the worst. Being one of the middle ones, he was always trying to prove his worth to the older ones. He followed me around the property, cornering me in isolated spots. "Where's your cleverness now, Mildred?" he would ask, pressing his body against mine, his hot and unpleasant breath on my face. "Are you going to read a book to get away from me?" I fought, pushed, scratched, but he was much stronger. Most of the time, I managed to break free before the worst happened, but I would come out of these situations with new bruises, new fear. One night, after 3 months of this treatment, something changed. I was in the kitchen, ironing clothes with a hot iron, when I heard a car stopping at the entrance to the farm. It was unusual for us to have visitors, especially at night. Through the window, I saw the same shiny car of the commissioner. Daddy appeared at the kitchen door, agitated. "Fix yourself up," he said, the tone urgent. "The commissioner is here and wants to speak with you." I was confused. Why would the commissioner want to speak with me? And why would Daddy, who had forbidden anyone to speak to me beyond what was necessary, now want me to present myself to a visitor? I cleaned my hands on my apron, tried to arrange my disheveled hair, and headed to the living room. The commissioner was sitting in the best armchair, the same one that was usually occupied by my father. Next to him, to my surprise, was Miss Helen, my teacher. "Ah, there she is," exclaimed the commissioner, standing up when I entered. "The brilliant young lady I've heard so much about." I looked confused at my father, who was standing tense, his hands behind his back. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mildred," continued the commissioner, "your teacher has been telling me about your exceptional performance at school. It's true that you haven't been attending classes in the last few months. Any health problem?" Before I could answer, my father stepped forward. "Mildred has been a bit indisposed, Mr. Commissioner. Nothing serious. She'll be back at school soon." Miss Helen looked me up and down, clearly noticing my state. Thinner, deep, dark circles, injured hands. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Well," said the commissioner, "I came here because we're starting a special program in our town. With the cotton processing factory growing, we need talented young people to work in the office. People who can read, write, and especially do accounts. Miss Helen recommended you as the best student in the region." My heart started beating faster. Was it an opportunity? A way out of that hell? "The program includes a small salary, and for those who come from more distant farms like you, we offer lodging in Miss Helen's own house, who has kindly offered herself as a tutor." I heard a noise and realized it was my father grinding his teeth. His forced smile was now just a tense line. "It's very kind of you, Mr. Commissioner," he said, "but Mildred is very necessary here on the farm. We're a large family. She helps her mother." "I understand," interrupted the commissioner, "but it would only be during the week. On weekends she could return home, and the salary would be a help for the family, wouldn't it?" I saw the conflict in my father's eyes. On one hand, he wanted to keep me there, submissive, broken. On the other, refusing a direct offer from the commissioner could bring consequences for his business. "We need to think," he finally said. "It's an important decision." Of course," agreed the commissioner, standing up. "But don't take too long. The program starts in 2 weeks and the spots are limited." When they left, I stood in the living room, not believing what had just happened. A door had opened, small, perhaps temporary, but a door nonetheless. My father's reaction came that same night after the commissioner and Miss Helen departed. He entered the kitchen like a hurricane, his face red with fury. "What did you do? How dare you talk about our family to strangers?" "I didn't say anything, Daddy," I answered, backing up until I hit the sink. "I haven't seen Miss Helen for months, since you forbade me to go to school." He advanced, grabbing my arm with such force that I felt his fingers sinking into my flesh. "Don't lie to me. That woman wouldn't come here without reason." "What did you tell her?" "Nothing, I swear." It was then that Mama entered the kitchen, something rare when my father was angry. She usually hid in these moments, knowing she could do nothing to help and that her presence would only make things worse. "Augustus," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "The girl is telling the truth. She hasn't left this farm in the last 3 months, you know that." "How could she have spoken with the teacher?" My father released my arm, turning to my mother. "Then how did that woman know? Why did she come here with the commissioner?" "Maybe because she cares about her students," said Mama, surprising everyone with her boldness. "Maybe because Mildred was the best student and suddenly disappeared." For a moment I thought my father was going to hit her. He approached, his fists clenched, but then something unusual happened. He stopped, took a deep breath, and gave a bitter laugh. "You two think you're clever, don't you? You think you can fool me, make plans behind my back?" "No, Augustus, we just—" "Silence!" he shouted, hitting his fist on the table. The dishes on top of it clinked with the impact. "Let me make one thing very clear. No one in this house does anything without my permission. No one leaves this farm unless I say they can." He turned to me, his finger pointed at my face. "And you, young lady, can forget this story about working in town. Your place is here, where I can keep an eye on you." It was then that Mama did something I had never seen her do in my entire life. She placed herself between me and my father, straightening her thin shoulders, her chin raised. "Augustus, please. This is an opportunity for our daughter. Think about what the commissioner will think if you refuse after he has personally come all the way here." My father hesitated, and I realized that Mama had touched on a sensitive point. His image before the important people in town mattered more than anything else. "Besides," continued Mama, taking advantage of the opening, "the commissioner mentioned a salary. Money that would be good for the farm, especially now that the harvest hasn't been as good as we expected." It was a lie. That year's harvest had been excellent. But my father wasn't involved with the household accounts. That was my mother's task. He frowned, thoughtful. "And she would return home every weekend," added Mama. "She would be here to help when we need her most." I saw the exact moment when he yielded, not out of kindness or concern for me, but out of calculation. The commissioner's favor was worth more than his desire to keep me prisoner. "We'll see," he finally said. "I'll think about it." That night, lying on my mat in the kitchen, I couldn't sleep. Hope is a dangerous thing when you've lived for years without it. Suddenly, there was a possibility, small, fragile, but real, of escaping, even if just for a few days a week, of seeing something beyond those walls, those men, that life. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. My father might have backed down momentarily, but he wouldn't give up control so easily. And my brothers, especially Jerome, wouldn't be happy with the idea of seeing me gain any freedom. What I didn't know that night, as I stared at the kitchen ceiling, imagining what it would be like to work in town, away from that farm, was that the real nightmare was yet to come. That the next few weeks would test my resistance like never before. And that I would discover, in the most painful way possible, how far my father was willing to go to maintain his control over our family. My father's decision came 2 days later. After dinner, when everyone was already retiring, he called me to the porch. His face had that closed expression that I knew so well, but there was something different in his eyes, a cold calculation that gave me chills. "You will go to town to work in the commissioner's office," he said, without beating around the bush. but with some conditions. I stood still, not daring to show any joy or relief. I knew that any emotion would be seen as weakness, as an opening for him to change his mind. First, all your salary comes straight to me. Second, you come back home every weekend without fail. Third, if I hear that you're walking around with boys or doing anything that brings shame to this family, you'll never set foot outside this farm again. Understand? Yes, Daddy, I answered, lowering my eyes. And one last thing, he added, coming so close that I could feel his hot whiskey breath. If you open your mouth to tell about how we live here, you'll bitterly regret it. Your mother will pay for every word you say. The threat was clear. I could gain a little freedom, but I would still be bound by invisible chains. Still, it was more than I had ever dreamed of. A chance to breathe, to see something beyond those walls. I thanked him and withdrew quickly before he changed his mind. In the following 2 weeks, the atmosphere on the farm became even more tense. My brothers, especially Jerome, seemed resentful of the privilege I had earned. The looks were more hostile, the comments more cruel. Some pretended I didn't exist, completely ignoring my presence. Others made a point of reminding me that my special place in town didn't change who I was, just a useless woman who needed to be kept in line. On the eve of my departure, Jerome cornered me in the barn while I was getting corn for the chickens. His face was contorted by an anger I had never seen before, not even in him. You think you're better than us, don't you? You think you're going to become a town lady, all important. No, Jerome, I'm just going to work, like everyone else here. He came closer, pressing me against the wooden wall of the barn. Don't forget your place, Mildred. You can go to town, but you'll always be what you are. A countrywoman who serves to cook and obey. Nothing more. I felt his heavy body against mine, his hands grabbing my arms with enough force to leave marks. For a terrible moment, I thought he would do something he had never done before, not just scare me or hurt me, but something much worse. I saw in his eyes a perverse desire to destroy me, to take away the only thing I had managed to protect until then. But something in me changed at that moment. Maybe it was the proximity of freedom, or maybe the anger I had been accumulating for years. Instead of shrinking, I looked directly into his eyes and said, with a voice I barely recognized myself, "Let me go, Jerome, now." The firmness in my voice caught him by surprise. For a second, he loosened his grip, and I took advantage to break free, pushing him with all the strength I had. He staggered backward, tripping over a sack of corn. "You'll regret this," he growled, but he didn't advance again. Something in my look must have warned him that I was no longer the same frightened girl as before. I left the barn trembling, but not from fear, from a strange mixture of terror and triumph. For the first time, I had directly confronted one of my tormentors, and I had survived. The next morning, Mama helped me arrange the small bundle with my few clothes. Her eyes were full of contradictory emotions, joy to see me escape, even if temporarily, from that hell. Fear of what could happen to me in town, and fear of what would happen to her when I was no longer there to help her. "Be careful, my child," she whispered, adjusting the collar of my only good dress, a faded blue one that had been hers in her youth. "The town has its own dangers. I'll be fine, Mama, and I'll come every weekend to help." She smiled sadly. "I know you will. But don't worry too much about me. Take advantage of this chance. Learn everything you can." Before handing me the bundle, she took something from inside her apron pocket. It was a small silver brooch, simple, in the shape of a bird. "It was my mother's," she explained, pinning it to my dress. "The only object I have left from her. I wish she could see you now, going to work in town." I was speechless. That brooch was Mama's most precious possession. The blue vase that Daddy had broken was a painful memory, but this brooch was her true treasure. "Mama, I can't accept it. It's too valuable." "That's exactly why I want you to have it," she insisted. "To remember where you came from and who you are, daughter. Not from the farm, not from your father, but from me and my mother before me. Women who survived. I hugged her tightly, feeling tears burning my eyes. Maybe it was the first time in my life that we embraced like this, without fear, without looking over our shoulder to see if someone was coming. My father and some of my brothers took me to town in one of the wagons. The 2-hour journey was made in heavy silence. When we arrived at the central square, where Miss Helen was waiting for me at the door of her house, my father just nodded to her, gave me one last warning look, and left, without a word of goodbye. Miss Helen took me into her small but comfortable house, showed me the room that would be mine, the first room just for me in my entire life, and then accompanied me to the commissioner's office where I would work. The first days were confusing and scary. I had never seen so many different people, never dealt with numbers and papers in that way. But they were also days of wonderful discoveries: running water that came out of the faucet like magic, electric light that turned on with a simple switch, books, so many books on Miss Helen's shelf that I could read every day for a year and not finish. When Friday came, part of me didn't want to go back to the farm. But I knew I needed to, not just because of my father's threat, but because Mama would be there, alone with him and my brothers, especially Jerome, who would certainly be even more resentful after our last encounter. Miss Helen accompanied me to the road where my father had promised to pick me up. He arrived punctually, driving the wagon with Theodore by his side. The journey back was as silent as the one going, although I felt the eyes of both evaluating me, as if looking for signs of change, of rebellion. When we arrived at the farm, I immediately realized that something was wrong. The door of the house was wide open, and I heard shouts coming from inside. Even before getting down from the wagon, I recognized my father's voice, louder and more drunk than normal, and my mother's muffled sobs. I ran inside, forgetting all caution. In the living room, I found a scene I will never forget. My mother kneeling on the floor, her face already swollen from crying, and my father standing in front of her, holding something small and shiny in his hand. My heart stopped when I recognized what it was: the bird brooch. "What is this?" he was shouting, shaking the brooch in front of her. "Why wasn't this with the other trinkets?" "It was my mother's, Augustus," Mama answered, her voice trembling. "Please, it's the only memento I have of her." "And you hid it from me all these years? What else are you hiding, woman?" That's when he saw me standing at the door. His bloodshot eyes narrowed. "You," he said, pointing at me. "This was with you, wasn't it? They found it in your room in town." I froze. It must have been Jerome. He had gone to town, spied on me, entered Miss Helen's house when no one was there. I saw his face at the window, watching the scene with a twisted smile. "Daddy, Quiet!" he roared. "Did you steal this from your mother, or did she give it to you to take? Are you two conspiring behind my back?" Before I could answer, he looked again at the brooch in his hand. Then, with a deliberate and cruel movement, he threw it on the floor and stepped on it hard. The sound of metal breaking under his boot was like a shot in the silence that followed. Mama let out a groan that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. 25 years of submission, of accepting everything without complaining, of sacrificing every little piece of herself. And now he had destroyed the only thing she had left of her past, of her identity, before becoming Augustus's wife. Something inside me broke along with that brooch. It wasn't just an object. It was the symbol of my mother's hope, of her silent resistance, of the promise she had made to me that we could survive, as the women before us had survived. And my father, by crushing it under his boot, wasn't just destroying a piece of metal. He was declaring once again his absolute power over us. He was saying that nothing, not even the most sacred memories, truly belonged to us. As I looked at the silver fragments scattered across the dirt floor, as I heard the low and satisfied laugh of Jerome coming from the window, as I saw my mother bent over the pieces, trying to gather what remained of her treasure, something changed inside me. The anger I had been cultivating for years was no longer a small, controlled ember. It was a fire, consuming everything, fear, hesitation, even prudence. At that moment, I swore to myself that that man, my father, and all my brothers who followed his example would pay for what they had done to us. Not with physical violence, I would never be like them, but in a way that would hit them where it hurt most, in their pride, in their reputation, in the power they so cherished. I would find a way to destroy them, just as they had tried to destroy us, year after year, tear after tear. The rest of that weekend was a nightmare. I returned to town on Monday with new bruises and a heart full of determination. At Miss Helen's house, I cried all the tears I had held back, telling her about the destroyed brooch, but not about the other horrors of the farm. She hugged me in silence, offered me chamomile tea, and let me sleep late the next day. At the commissioner's office, I worked with redoubled diligence. Each number I added, each paper I organized was a step away from that farm, a brick in the construction of my independence. But I knew that just running away wouldn't be enough. I needed to ensure that my mother was also safe, and that my father and my brothers, especially Jerome, paid for everything they had done. It was almost by chance that I discovered the first clue. I was organizing the rural tax documents when I saw the name of our farm, Thompson's Haven. The declared value of the production was much less than I knew we produced. Being a farmer's daughter, even without ever being included in business conversations, I knew the numbers, how many acres of cotton we had, how much they yielded, how much each bale was worth. Intrigued, I began to pay more attention. In the following days, I stayed after hours, telling the commissioner I wanted to learn more about the records. He, pleased with my dedication, gave me permission to study the documents. That's how I discovered that my father declared only half of the farm's cotton production. The other half, presumably, was sold under the table, without taxes, probably to clandestine buyers. It was a tax evasion scheme that must have been going on for years. But that wasn't all. In a locked drawer that I managed to open when everyone had already gone, I learned to pick locks by watching my brothers when they thought I wasn't looking, I found loan records. My father owed a considerable amount to a man named Joseph Grant, known in the region as a ruthless loan shark. From the exorbitant interest rates and the payment dates, it seemed that my father was only managing to pay the interest, without ever touching the principal amount. These two secrets were powerful, but I needed more details, more certainties, before acting. In the following weeks, I continued my silent investigation. On weekends, I returned to the farm as promised, enduring the heavy atmosphere and mistreatment with a new patience, fueled by the certainty that soon all of this would end. I approached Mr. Jenkins, the town's mailman, a kind gentleman who knew all the secrets of the region. We started talking during my lunch hour when he passed by the office. One day, I casually mentioned the name of Joseph Grant. "Ah, Grant," he said, lowering his voice. "He's a dangerous man, girl. They say he's already had the legs broken of those who don't pay on time. There are people who prefer to sell everything they have rather than owe him." "Does he have many clients around here?" I asked, feigning casual curiosity. "More than he should." "Farmers, mainly, who take money to invest in the crop and then can't pay. Grant has enforcers in all the neighboring towns. They say even the police are afraid of him." That information was like gold to me. I continued talking with Mr. Jenkins in the following days, collecting more details about Grant and his methods. Meanwhile, at the office, I found more documents that confirmed my father's tax evasion. In a folder marked Confidential, which the commissioner had asked me to file, I found a report from the IRS about tax evasion investigations in the region. My father's farm wasn't on the list, but there was mention of information received about possible irregularities in properties in the western sector of the county, exactly where our farm was located. The plan began to form in my head. It wouldn't be a direct revenge, with my own hands. It would be something more sophisticated, using my father's own corrupt system against him. In the third week of December, 4 months after I started working in town, I felt I had all the necessary information. It was a Thursday, the eve of my return to the farm for the weekend. After everyone left the office, I stayed behind, saying I wanted to finish organizing some documents. Alone, I picked up the public telephone in the hallway. My heart was beating so hard I thought I might faint. I dialed the number of the IRS office in Atlanta, the largest nearby city, which I had found in one of the official documents. "Good afternoon," said a male voice on the other end. "Good afternoon," I replied, trying to disguise my voice. "I would like to make an anonymous report about tax evasion." There was a pause. "Go ahead, ma'am." "What kind of evasion?" With the firmest voice I could muster, I detailed everything I had discovered about the undeclared sales from my father's farm, about how he kept double accounting, about the clandestine buyers who always came on the first Friday of each month, a detail I had discovered by overhearing a conversation between my father and Gerald. The IRS agent asked several questions, noting everything down. In the end, he thanked me for the information and said it would be investigated. "Do you have any idea when this investigation might happen?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "I can't be precise, but with detailed reports like this, we usually act quickly. A matter of days, perhaps." "Perfect." After hanging up, I took a few deep breaths. I was only halfway through the plan. I picked up the phone again and dialed another number, this one found on a crumpled piece of paper in my father's drawer when I went through his documents during a weekend on the farm. A man with a hoarse voice answered on the third ring. "Who's this?" "Good evening," I said, again disguising my voice. "I need to speak with Mr. Joseph Grant. It's about a client of his, Augustus Thompson." There was a tense silence, then the voice changed. It was another man, the voice deeper and more authoritative. "Who wants to know?" "I'm a person who works for him. I overheard a conversation today that you should know about. Augustus is planning to flee after the next harvest without paying the debt. He said he has everything arranged to go to Tennessee, where he has relatives." It was a complete lie, of course, but based on a real detail. My father really did have relatives in Tennessee, although he never spoke to them. Another silence, then a dry laugh. "Is that so? And why are you telling me this?" I had anticipated this question. "Because he hasn't paid me for 3 months. He said he doesn't have money, but I know he's saving for this escape. I thought you should know." "Interesting," said Grant, his voice now calculating. "And when exactly does he plan to do this?" "I heard it would be after the main harvest, which starts next week. He has a large shipment to deliver on the first Friday of next month. He's going to use that money for the escape." More silence. Then, "I appreciate the information. I'll personally check on this matter." I hung up the phone with trembling hands. It was done. I had just lit the fuse of 2 different explosives, and both were scheduled to detonate at the same time. The next day, I returned to the farm as always, trying to act normally. It was the hardest weekend of my life, smiling, serving, lowering my head, knowing what was about to happen. The tension was so great that I almost betrayed myself several times, dropping plates, stumbling, answering questions wrong. "What's wrong with you, girl?" my father asked on Sunday night, watching me with suspicion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nothing, Daddy," I answered, lowering my eyes. "Just tired from work in town." He mumbled something about real work and went back to smoking his pipe. On Monday, I returned to town with a knot in my stomach. Part of me worried about my mother. What if she got hurt in the middle of the confusion I had orchestrated? But another part knew that this was the only chance we had to free ourselves from that hell. A whole week passed without news. I began to fear that my plan had failed, that no one had taken my report seriously. Then, on the following Thursday, while I was at the office, I heard a commotion in the square. I looked out the window and saw 3 official IRS cars passing towards the exit of the town, the road that led to our farm. My heart raced. It was the beginning of the end. That night, Miss Helen received a phone call. It was from the town's police station. They needed me to go there immediately. When we arrived, we found an IRS officer and the local sheriff. They informed me that my father and my older brothers had been arrested for tax evasion and resisting arrest. "And my mother?" I asked, fear showing in my voice. "She's fine, but very shaken," answered the sheriff. "We need you to go there." On the way to the farm, in the police car, the IRS officer told me what had happened. When they arrived to conduct the inspection, they found not only evidence of tax evasion, but also a chaotic situation. Joseph Grant and 2 enforcers had arrived shortly before, confronting my father about the supposed escape. A violent fight had broken out. "It was a strange coincidence," commented the officer. "It seems someone also reported your father to the loan shark." I kept a neutral expression, despite the whirlwind of emotions. It really is a coincidence. When we arrived at the farm, the scene was surreal. Official cars, police officers, handcuffed men being placed in patrol cars. The house was partially destroyed, broken furniture, shattered windows, signs of struggle everywhere. I found my mother sitting on the porch with a blanket over her shoulders and a cup of tea in her hands, being attended to by a social worker. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. I ran to her and hugged her tightly. "It's over, Mama," I whispered in her ear. "It's over forever." She moved away a little, looking into my eyes. There was something new there, not just relief, but a kind of silent understanding. "You did this, didn't you?" she asked softly, so that no one else could hear. I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded slightly. There was no need to lie to her, not anymore. A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of something deeper, recognition, perhaps, that her daughter had done what she never had the courage to do. "Let's go to town," I said, helping her to stand up. "We can stay with Miss Helen for now." As we moved away from the farm, I looked back one last time. The men who had turned our lives into hell were being taken away, defeated not by physical force, but by the intelligence of a girl they had always considered inferior. Justice had arrived, not like a lightning bolt from the sky, but like a meticulous plan, executed with patience and precision. At that moment, I knew that my life and my mother's would never be the same again. The road ahead was open, for the first time, to possibilities we had never dared to imagine. Today, my dears, I live a life I never imagined possible in those dark times. I'm 76 years old, and I live in this cozy apartment in Asheville, a city that welcomed me as a daughter. The first time I saw these mountains covered in mist, I knew I had found my place in the world. The path here wasn't easy or direct. After that fateful day when the farm was invaded by IRS agents and loan shark enforcers, Mama and I stayed living with Miss Helen for almost 6 months. The commissioner, impressed with my work and touched by our situation, offered me a permanent job at the county office with a better salary. Mama found work in the house of a rich family in town, no longer as a maid who did everything, but as a respected cook with regular days off and a room of her own. My father and my older brothers stayed in prison for almost 2 years. The younger ones were released faster, but the farm was confiscated to pay the debts and back taxes. Some of them moved to other towns, others went to work as employees on neighboring farms. Jerome, the one who tormented me the most, received the longest sentence for resisting arrest and assaulting police officers. I never returned to that farm. I learned that it was sold at auction to a businessman from the city who transformed everything into a modern cotton plantation with machinery and registered workers. The stories we lived there were buried along with the old house, which was demolished to make way for new facilities. For 5 years, I worked at the county office and studied at night, completing my education. Miss Helen encouraged me to apply for college in Nashville. When I was accepted for the accounting program, Mama cried with pride. She was already different then, stronger, more confident, as if each day away from that farm returned to her a bit of the woman she could have been. It was in college that I met Edward, my husband. He was an assistant professor, a few years older than me, with infinite patience to explain the most difficult concepts. We grew close during an extension project that helped small business owners organize their finances. In our long conversations, I ended up telling him about my past. Instead of pity or shock, he showed understanding and respect for the strength I had to change my story. We married in 1972 in a simple ceremony with Mama, Miss Helen, and some college friends. Edward was invited to work for a company in Asheville, and so we moved here, where we built our life. We had 3 children, Mary, Luke, and Claire, who grew up hearing stories about Grandma Eleanor and her songs from the Tennessee mountains, but never knew all the dark details of the farm. Some stories are like old scars. They are part of us, but don't need to be exposed all the time. Mama lived with us until she passed away in 1998 at 85 years old. They were years of healing for her. Here in Asheville, away from the memories of the farm, she flourished. She learned to read and write, made crochet that she sold at craft fairs, became a loving grandmother who always had a soft lap and a story to lull the children to sleep. When she departed, it was in peace, in her own bed, surrounded by a family that loved her. So different from what her fate might have been if we had remained on that farm. Edward left us 7 years ago after a battle with cancer. It was 46 years of a marriage based on mutual respect and companionship, something I didn't even know was possible during my childhood and adolescence. He taught me that not all men are like my father and my brothers, that there is tenderness in male hands, that deep voices can also speak sweet words. Today, I live surrounded by the happy memories we built together. My orchids on the porch are my passion and my therapy. Each flower that opens is a small victory, a reminder that beauty can be born even after the most violent storms. My grandchildren come to visit me frequently. There are already 7 of them, and each brings a different joy to my life. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, when I'm alone with my memories, I still think about that farm, about that frightened girl I was. I think about how everything could have been different if I hadn't found the courage to act. If I hadn't met people like Miss Helen and Dorothy, who showed me there was a world beyond those fences. I don't carry hatred in my heart, not even for my father or for Jerome. Time and distance have transformed that blazing anger into something more like pity. They were prisoners too, in a different way. Prisoners of brutal ignorance, of a distorted view of the world where power over others was the only way they felt like men. What I've learned throughout this life that has already gone far is that our greatest victory isn't punishing those who harmed us, but building a life so good and so full that that harm becomes just a distant chapter, no longer the center of our story. That's what I want to talk to you about how we can, with courage and determination, rewrite our destinies, even when it seems impossible. My dears, in sharing this story with you today, I'm not just looking to unburden myself or relive the past. I want my journey to serve as a beacon for someone who might be facing their own personal hell at this very moment, without glimpsing a way out. I've learned that age doesn't define our strength, but rather our capacity to start anew each day. When I was on that farm, at 13, 14, 15 years old, I thought my life would end there. That I would never know anything beyond those fences, those humiliations, that constant fear. But life taught me that even in the deepest darkness, our inner light never completely goes out. My wrinkles are maps of survival. Each one tells a story of pain overcome. I look at my hands today, caring for my orchids, and can hardly believe they are the same hands that trembled with fear and anger in that dark kitchen. I never allowed my dignity to be stolen, even when they tried to take everything from me. For you who are trapped in a situation that seems to have no way out, whether in an abusive family, a toxic relationship, or any other physical or emotional prison, know that there is always a path. Sometimes we don't see it immediately, but it exists. It may be winding. It may require patience and courage, but it exists. I discovered that we are stronger than we imagine, especially when we think we can't take it anymore. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but it teaches us to live with them and still smile. My story isn't about what they did to me, but about how I chose to respond. I learned that true strength isn't in never falling, but in getting up every time. The invisible scars I carried for years didn't define me. They refined me like gold in fire. Age has given me the wisdom to understand that our story doesn't end in the painful chapters. Surviving is a form of resistance, and living well is the best revenge. Breaking cycles of abuse isn't just an act of self-preservation, but a gift we give to the next generations. My children and grandchildren grew up in a home where voices weren't weapons, where men weren't tyrants, where women weren't shadows. And you, my dears, who have followed my story to this point, if this account has touched your heart in some way, I ask that you subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who might need to hear this message of hope. Each subscription, each share can be the first step for someone to find the courage to change their own story. Leave in the comments the word Mildred if you watched until here. It's a way of telling me that you're with me on this journey of memories and overcoming. When I read your comments, I feel that my story wasn't in vain, that it served something greater than myself. Do it now, don't wait even one more minute. And know, my dears, that if there's one thing I've learned in these 76 years of life, it's that it's never, ever too late to start over. My mother's bird brooch may have been crushed that day, but its spirit, the spirit of freedom, of flight, of possibility, lives in me to this day. And now, it lives a little bit in you too. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Grandparents' Tales if you haven't already. And please tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Is it morning with your coffee, afternoon break, or evening relaxation time? I love hearing from all of you.